The Americans will not fight, a Soviet advisor told the North Korean pilots at Antong Airfield. Their jets are old. They will run. November 8, 1950. The Yalu River, northern Korea, 10 minutes past noon. A flight of MiG-15s dropped out of high cloud cover at roughly 30,000 feet, diving toward a formation of American fighter bombers working over the bridges at Sinwiju. The MiG pilots had reason for confidence. Their aircraft carried swept wings, 35 degrees of sweep, copied partly from captured German research. It could climb at nearly 10,000 feet per minute. It carried two 23mm cannon and a single 37mm cannon, weapons sized to destroy bombers. Against the straight-winged American jets flying below, the MiG-15 held every measurable aerodynamic advantage: speed, ceiling, climb rate. The textbook said the fight should already be over. The American jets below them, F-80 shooting stars from the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing, looked like relics by comparison. Straight wings. A fuselage designed around a de Havilland engine the British had sold to the Soviets, who reverse-engineered it into the Klimov RD-45 that now powered the MiG. The F-80 traced its lineage to 1943. By 1950, Air Force procurement officers already considered it a second-line aircraft, overtaken by the swept-wing F-86 Sabre, still arriving in theater. If you're watching this and know something about this fight I missed, drop it in the comments. Hit like if you think the shooting star deserves more credit than it gets, and subscribe so the next one finds you. First Lieutenant Russell J. Brown flew one of those F-80s that afternoon. He came from Pasadena, California. He'd flown P-47s in the Second World War, but never fired at another aircraft in anger. Brown spotted the MiGs diving toward the formation and pulled into them. What happened next took less than 90 seconds. Brown closed on a MiG-15 from behind in a diving turn, fired his 6.50 caliber machine guns, and watched the MiG trail smoke, then fire, then fall. The Soviet and North Korean records from this engagement remain incomplete. Sources conflict on whether the pilot survived, whether the aircraft crashed north or south of the Yalu, and even whether the MiG belonged to a Soviet crewed unit or a North Korean squadron with Soviet advisors. The American gun camera footage exists. 5th Air Force credited Brown with the kill. 6.50 caliber machine guns against an aircraft built to shrug off 20mm cannon fire. A straight-wing jet from 1943 against a swept-wing interceptor, representing everything the Soviets had learned from German aerodynamics. Brown had no business winning that fight. The engagement geometry favored him. He caught the MiG in a diving turn where the F-80's lower wing loading actually helped, but the kill still looked like an anomaly. The Air Force treated it as one. They rushed F-86 Sabres to Korea and quietly shuffled the shooting star into the ground attack role, where it flew more sorties than any other American jet in the war. Nobody built a monument to what Russell Brown did over Sinwiju. The F-80 just kept flying. How do you build a jet fighter when nobody in America has ever built one? Clarence Kelly Johnson knew the answer in June of 1943. You steal a tent, set it up next to a plastics factory in Burbank that smelled like death, and you hire 128 engineers and fabricators who don't ask questions about schedule. Lockheed gave him 180 days to deliver a flying prototype around a British de Havilland H-1B turbojet engine. Johnson did it in 143. The XP-80 rolled out looking like nothing the Army Air Forces had seen. Smooth, low-slung, with air intakes buried in the wing roots and a laminar flow wing Lockheed's aerodynamicists hand-shaped in the tunnel. It flew on January 8, 1944, at Muroc Dry Lake. Test pilot Milo Burcham took it to 502 miles per hour on the first sortie. The P-51 Mustang, the best piston fighter America had, topped out around 440. Johnson's team had added 60 miles per hour in a tent that reeked of chemicals, with an engine they'd received late and a budget the Pentagon kept threatening to cut. 4 prototypes flew, 2 crashed. Test pilot Milo Burcham died in October 1944 during a routine demonstration flight when the engine flamed out on approach. The accident report blamed fuel starvation. Johnson reportedly refused to speak about it for weeks. The early Allison-built J-33 engines that replaced the British de Havilland unit ran hot, flamed out without warning, and gulped fuel at rates that gave the F-80 a combat radius barely worth mentioning, about 100 miles on internal fuel in the early models. Maintenance crews at Langley and March Field logged an average of 47 man-hours per flight hour, keeping those engines turning. The P-51 needed 11. The Pentagon noticed. Before the F-80 even entered squadron service, procurement memos from Wright Field already referred to it as an interim design. The phrase shows up in a November 1944 evaluation. Interim design, bridge to the next generation. The aircraft hadn't fought yet, and headquarters had already written its obituary. Production ramped anyway. Lockheed delivered 1,715 F-80s between 1945 and 1950. Unit cost ran about $95,000, roughly $1.5 million in today's money. Cheap even then. The airframe kept accepting modifications the way a pickup truck accepts miles. New engines, tip tanks for range, reinforced wings for bomb racks, upgraded avionics. By the time the Korean War started, the F-80C model carried the J-33A, 35 engine producing 5,400 pounds of thrust, tip tanks that stretched its range to something usable, and 6 M350 caliber machine guns harmonized at 1,000 feet. It still looked like a stopgap. Kelly Johnson had moved on to the F-104 Starfighter. The Air Force had moved on to the F-86. The F-80 hadn't moved on from anything. It just showed up to work. Major Louis Sabile rolled in on a North Korean convoy south of Hamchang on August 5, 1950. His F-80 trailing smoke from ground fire he'd already taken on the first pass. His wingmen called for him to break off. Sabile kept the dive. He put his aircraft into the trucks, posthumous Medal of Honor, the first awarded to an Air Force officer in any war. Sabile had been flying close air support for 3 days straight, sleeping in a cot beside the runway at Ashia, Japan, eating whatever the mess tent had cold. The F-80 squadrons of the 8th Fighter Bomber Wing operated like that for weeks. They crossed the strait, bombed, strafed, came back, rearmed, and crossed again. Nobody in those units talked about air-to-air combat. They talked about roads, bridges, troop concentrations, and the T-34 tanks grinding south toward Pusan. The T-34 mattered. Soviet-designed sloped armor, 85mm gun. North Korea fielded roughly 250 of them in the initial push. South Korean forces had nothing that could stop one frontally. American bazookas bounced off the glacis plate. The F-80's 650 calibers couldn't penetrate the hull either, but 5-inch rockets and 1,000-pound bombs could, and the Shooting Star carried both. 5th Air Force records credit F-80s with destroying a substantial number of those tanks in July and August of 1950, though exact figures vary between unit reports and Far East Air Force's summaries. The discrepancy runs about 30%. Nobody reconciled it. What the numbers don't show is the effect on North Korean logistics. General William F. Dean, captured at Daejeon on July 20th, later wrote that American air attacks destroyed more equipment on the roads than his infantry ever engaged directly. He meant the F-80s. They owned those roads in daylight. The losses mounted. 17 Shooting Stars fell to ground fire in the first 2 months. Anti-aircraft guns, mostly Soviet-supplied 37mm automatic cannon, punched through the F-80's thin aluminum skin without effort. The aircraft had no armor worth mentioning around the engine bay. One hit to the tailpipe area, and the J-33 seized or caught fire. Pilots learned to stay above 3,000 feet on strafing runs, which cut accuracy, which meant more passes, which meant more exposure. A nasty arithmetic. Then, in late October, something changed over the Yalu. American reconnaissance pilots began reporting swept-wing fighters at high altitude, fast, climbing hard, gone before anyone could react. The reports filtered up to 5th Air Force headquarters at Nagoya. The intelligence staff identified the aircraft as MiG-15s, flown from Manchurian bases the Americans could not legally strike. The F-80 pilots heard the briefings and did the math themselves. Their aircraft topped out at 580 miles per hour in clean configuration. The MiG could reach 668. No new tactics came down. The shooting stars stayed on the line. Brown pushed the throttle to the firewall and pulled into the diving MiGs. He picked one, the trailing aircraft in a flight of 4, slightly wide of the formation, turning left and descending through 20,000 feet. Brown cut inside the turn. The F-80 shuddered. At that speed, in that bank, the airframe pulled somewhere around 5 Gs, enough to gray his vision at the edges, enough to feel his helmet settle hard against his skull, and his oxygen mask dig into the bridge of his nose. The MiG pilot never saw him. Soviet training doctrine at Antung emphasized speed and vertical maneuvering. Get in, climb away. Nobody had briefed these pilots on what to do if an American closed to guns range from the low 6. Why would they? The performance gap made it theoretically impossible. Brown fired at roughly 1,500 feet of range. The 6 M3 Brownings threw a combined 72 rounds per second, each bullet weighing about 1.5 ounces, converging at a harmonization point 1,000 feet ahead of the nose. He held the trigger for approximately 3 seconds. 216 rounds, give or take. The MiG's fuselage sparked and smoked, then a fire opened up along the wing route. If the engagement had lasted another 4 seconds, if that MiG pilot had looked over his shoulder once, Brown likely dies over the Yalu, and the first jet versus jet kill belongs to somebody else, maybe a Sabre pilot 3 months later. He didn't look. Anyway, the after-action report filed by the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing calls the engagement a stern-quarter attack, resulting in the destruction of 1 enemy aircraft. 12 words for 90 seconds of combat. The gun camera film shows the MiG rolling left, trailing a thickening black smear, dropping below the frame. 5th Air Force Intelligence reviewed the footage and confirmed the kill on November 9th. Brown landed at Kimpo with a full ammunition load, minus roughly 200 rounds from one pass. His crew chief noticed the airframe had taken no hits. Brown filled out his paperwork, ate dinner, and flew another ground attack mission the next morning. The Air Force issued a press release. Then it went back to waiting for the Sabres. The rear cockpit of a T-33 had a stick, a throttle, and a full set of instruments identical to the front. That mattered more than anything Kelly Johnson ever designed for combat. Lockheed built the 2-seat variant almost as an afterthought. The TP-80C, first flight in March of 1948, essentially an F-80 with the fuselage stretched 3 feet and a second canopy grafted behind the first. The Air Force ordered 699. It ordered more, and then NATO did the same. By the time production ended in 1959, Lockheed and its licensees had delivered 6,557 T-33s to 33 countries. The airframe that headquarters called an interim design trained virtually every Western jet pilot who flew between 1950 and 1980. The numbers border on absurd. The Air Training Command at Randolph Field alone graduated more than 20,000 student pilots through the T-33 pipeline in the 1950s. The F-86 Sabre pilots who fought in Korea learned jet transition in a T-33. So did the F-4 Phantom crews that went to Vietnam. The aircraft they dismissed trained the men who won. Had Lockheed proposed the T-33 as a dedicated trainer from the start, the Pentagon likely rejects it as overbuilt and too expensive. But that's beside the point. A 1972 Tactical Air Command maintenance review noted that the T-33 averaged only 8.6 maintenance man-hours per flight hour, down from the F-80's brutal 47. The report credits airframe simplicity and the mature J-33-35 engine, which by then had accumulated millions of flight hours across the fleet. The word the report uses is dependable. For a military document, that passes for a love letter. Student pilots broke T-33s regularly. They over-G'd them, landed them hard, flamed out the engines, spun them, and walked away. The ejection seat worked. The gear absorbed punishment. Lieutenants who had no business surviving their mistakes survived them, became captains, and eventually ran squadrons and commands. Bolivia retired its last operational T-33 in 2017, 69 years after the first flight. The interim design outlasted the Soviet Union. The F-86 that replaced it in combat served 25 years. The F-4 that followed served 40. The T-33 outlasted them all and never stopped teaching. 14 F-80s fell to MiGs over Korea. Another 99 went down to ground fire. 113 shooting stars lost in combat across 3 years of war. The F-80 flew 98,515 sorties in Korea. Roughly 70% of those, close air support. The aircraft built to intercept bombers spent the war killing trucks and bridges, carrying ordnance loads Kelly Johnson never imagined hanging off those straight wings. By mid-1951, the Sabres had taken over air superiority, and the shooting stars settled permanently into the mud-moving role nobody wanted and everybody needed. The pilots accepted it. Some of them had flown P-47s in the last war and recognized the pattern. The glamour goes to the interceptors. The work goes to you. The heat off a napalm strike at low altitude blistered the underside paint on the wings. Ground crews at Suwon scrubbed carbon scoring from the gun ports every night with rags and solvent, their hands raw by morning. 6 F-80 pilots earned the kill designation of ace. Sources conflict on this, and at least 2 of those tallies include credits from other airframes. The records don't say whether Brown's MiG was confirmed by Soviet lost data. Russian archives opened partially in the 1990s list a damaged aircraft returning to Antung on November 8, 1950, pilot uninjured, damaged, not destroyed. Draw your own conclusion from the gun camera film. The F-80 cost $57,000 per unit in 1945. The F-86 that replaced it ran $319,000. I think the shooting star earned more than it got. Total production: 1,718 F-80s, 6,557 T-33s. Combined flight hours across all variants exceed 15 million. Russell Brown retired from the Air Force as a colonel. He settled in the suburbs outside Washington, D.C., and rarely gave interviews. He died in 2004 at 78.